the key thing with climate change, which is what we're going to talk about, and contraction and convergence, which is the way to think about shaping the response to it, is crucially about thinking in this full loop analysis. There is no away. When you throw something away wrong, there is no away. It's always coming back. What goes around, as they say, New York taxi drivers are fond of saying this, what goes around comes around. So let's divert a little into music, and all will hopefully become clear. So you can think of it as a metaphor, as a parable, as a little logo, as a whatever you like. But essentially, with or without the religion, it's 3 and 1. 3 and 1, 3 and 2 and 1 are the same one. I thought I'd abandoned my musical career when 20 years ago my daughter said, "Is the planet dying, Daddy?" She was 4 and I was about 44. And I thought never in human history has a kid or any kid had to ask such a lunatic question. So lying through my teeth, I said to her, "Of course not, darling, but in case it is, we'll fix it." And so these are the kind of mind games you end up playing with people who manage with measurement for a living and fail to solve the problem. Here's your piece of string. So the first bit is a little related to where I have come from. That really is the string. That's the harmonic structure you get out of the string as you divide it that way. The nice part about this part is this is just true. It doesn't go away, it's just true. Now, you must be thinking, what the hell is this guy on about? Well, and especially, thanks for the appreciation, especially what the hell had that satellite got to do with things, wandering across this kind of mystic bullshit sky? Well, there is a satellite out there called Voyager. It's beyond the solar system now, and on it are artifacts of human civilization. One of them is Yehudi Menuhin, a recording of him, that is to say, playing that piece as an emblem of what humanity was about before it made itself extinct. He didn't see it that way then, but he probably does now. And the reason is what's literally happening here. And it's good before you think about it to feel about it. if you're going to try and do that in a corporate business HQ, what happens next is, the options are limited. They can either say, what the hell's this got to do with us? Or they can get the point and jump out of the 21st floor window. Or they can say, as increasingly they do, okay, so actually this problem is real, of course it's real. What are we going to do about it? But bear in mind, their key means of engagement is what you can measure, you can manage. So it very, very quickly, as probably all of you know, both as involved practitioners having to make a living, but also involved practitioners being concerned about how we are all having our livings made for us by large institutions who make us feel powerless, it inexorably involves money. And money is just a kind of an abstraction. Money is a measuring system. I mean, before you impart any notions of value, the price of so-and-so is, 2 oranges for £1, or 15 dead Indians for £4. Economics is horribly about imposing values through this entirely arbitrary means, which crucially has no sense of how to measure, let alone what it is measuring. They understand it? No, they don't. They're absolutely captive, just as we all are, and our governments are, to what you might call mismanagement by mismeasurement. And climate change has really called the bluff, everybody's bluff on this. If you previously didn't know where we were going, and probably got away with it, as we all have done, which is we didn't really need to know where we were going. We probably wanted good results by the end of a term, or good returns by the end of a quarter, or whatever it was. Climate change is a big issue, is really challenging us about where is this going. And the essence of the challenge that faces us now is how, just as an ordinary kid on the block, do you engage with a problem which is captured in one concept, for me, ahead of everything else, which is quite obviously, if you're candid about this problem, we are causing it much faster than we are responding to avoid it. So if you get into any kind of heavy debates downstream in your lives from here about climate change, engage with people who are struggling to engage with the issue. That is the key test of how to position yourself when you answer, or you try to answer the questions, what are you doing about it? Well, clearly, whatever it takes, we are positioning to solve this problem faster than we're creating it, to reverse that ratio of causation. So presently with emissions, we're causing climate change faster than we're responding to avoid it. The UN process has not, sadly, been effective. It's getting worse with time. How do you reverse that ratio? How do you solve it faster than you're causing it? Musicians are fundamentally involved in the issue of measuring, but with time. Everything is time dependency. It's not only that the frequencies dictated on the length of string give you all the harmonics that give you the fundamental structure of music as frequencies. What you're also involved in is the slower equivalent of that, which is meter. That sounds fancy. It's not. It's what we all do. If we dance or we sing or recite poetry, whatever, it has rhythm. So to go back to the 1, 2, 3 game, here's 1. 1. 1. Yeah? Now if I cut that in half, like I did with a piece of paper, it's 1. Yeah? Cut in half. And if, as you saw in the beginning of the movie, you also cut it into 3, you actually get, yeah? So you might be waltzing or something like that. And if you do the 2 and the 3 in the same space of the 1, you get rhythm. Right? It's irresistible, it's energetic, it just kind of, it's a wake up to anybody who's got their ears open and is alive and responsive. So the issue of understanding measurement has this bigger challenge, which is this is truly a long-term problem. So before we examine that, I want to show you one thing which absolutely radically simplifies the practical task with which we're all confronted in terms of understanding the need for emissions, greenhouse gas emissions control. And the reason for it is the objective of the Climate Convention, which is to stabilize the rising concentration of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. So the emissions from our society you can think of as a flow. The atmosphere is like a stock where it's accumulating. But if that sounds too fancy, or somebody says, hang on, you don't understand that, you can do this. The emissions are a flow from a tap of water. The atmosphere is like a bath where it's accumulating. You could say the natural sinks are like a plug hole in the bath, where under normal conditions, the emissions drain away from the atmosphere via the plug hole. It's literally that simple. So when the atmosphere is at a constant concentration of greenhouse gas, the thing we're all supposed to be really concerned about, the sources of gas and the sinks for the gas are at balance. Okay, so what goes up comes down. It's cyclic, it varies over time. We've got, in a moment, data for 1 million years, which shows you how cyclic that is. But overall, it's at equilibrium. There's no human signature, and thank God for that, because now you come to this. Here's over 500,000 years, methane concentrations going up and down between 300 and 700 parts per billion. Sounds fancy, but just notice the wiggly line and how it's correlated with temperature. This is data that's not disputed. The same shape of that curve is there. It tended to go up and down together. Okay, so temperature was varying between 5 and 15 degrees Celsius. And the last one we'll add is CO2. And there you can see it going up and down, and you can see the modern day era comes to that. I'll just go back and catch that. 1800 is where the fun starts. 1800 is where fossil fuel burning starts. 1800 is where the Industrial Revolution begins, and the tap starts on the left, if you can see that up there, starts flowing into the bath. And in the 200 years since that time until now, 208 years, we have managed to raise the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere by over 40% above the pre-industrial level. And the key thing is that axis along the bottom here is also a time axis. It's happened geologically speaking, in the twinkling of an eye. I mean, it's the equivalent of a very hard karate punch on the solar plexus of the planet, on the atmosphere. So the tap comes on, you can see the bath starts filling up, temperature, the reddening suggests greenhouse gases do trap heat, and the question mark turns into an exclamation mark. The point about the bath overflowing there is the natural sinks for the gases, like the oceans and the forests, under extreme conditions, under extreme provocation, can themselves become sources. So it's kind of familiar and obvious. If you heat up water on the stove, you've got a pan of water, beyond a certain point it starts bubbling out. Well, steam comes out as gas, but other gases will come out as well. If you heat up the oceans, they absorb less and they emit more. If you burn a forest, it normally is capturing CO2, it's obviously releasing it. If the forest floor catches all that carbon in the soil goes up as well. All of this potentially loads the atmosphere in a way that we absolutely do not want to happen. So the key issue is, can you solve the problem faster than you're creating it? Can you develop a measurement system that can demonstrate that you're committed to act on that understanding? And at that point, you suddenly realize, you're just a kid who lives next door to the kennel. You're dealing with every single other person, every other discipline, every other country, every other culture, every other stored up set of grievances about history and the state we're in on the planet. I mean, you go from 1 to 6 billion and rising with all that complexity thrown in. the science, the economics, and so on, and you go at the UN and you have people struggling out of the first debate saying, Jesus Christ, on this debate everything's on the agenda. And it really is. And you have, this is back in 1990, you have Indian women coming out of the debate, they're negotiators, they're fairly hard, and they're in tears saying, they're blaming us for having too many babies. This is going on. I mean, that was just day one, and it's worse these days than it was then. And the key about this, here's just a summary proposition. This graphic shows you 200 years past from 2002, 100 years forward. Industrial countries are in blue. What is shown is emissions from fossil fuel burning weighed as tons of carbon. Developing countries are in yellow. So the past is a pattern of what you can call expansion and divergence. We'll do this in more detail. The future is a pattern of contraction and convergence. The data on which the left-hand side of the graphic is based is data that comes from the US government. So remember, all the blue countries are the industrial countries, that's like us. At the bottom, you'll see very quickly what I'm talking about, what the data tells us. There you can see the United Kingdom and Germany. Going down through all the United States, they are confronted with Texas, having emissions, Texas alone, which has got about the population of, I don't know, 2 Londons, more than the United Kingdom in its entirety. And next to all of that, about the future, you've got the countries that are most vulnerable with a very small emission signature. The throwaways of the small island states is where sort of Greenpeace initially pitched the whole campaign, save the small island states. If you look in proportion to what's happened and what needs to happen, it's quite obvious that the developed so-called countries have had the lion's share of causation. And all of this is complicated by that thing I mentioned a moment ago, which is money. If these are emissions, they are a direct proxy for wealth. Emissions and income practically go hand in hand. Here's the, this is very quickly a little movie, comes from probably the most important data gathering exercise on the planet in Mauna Loa, Hawaii, who for roughly 40 years now have been recording the rise steadily, day by day, the rise of concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. So this is real data, and this is their real-time movie. Here it goes. There's a clock running up in the top right-hand corner here. We start off in 1990. The flip-flop up and down is seasonal, because in the northern hemisphere, which is the right-hand side, we emit carbon from trees in winter, they shed the leaves, but we reabsorb during summer. So that explains that oscillation. But you can see the trend average is rising steadily. The trend average is the blue line. And we're coming up to where the movie stops at December 2002. You can see at that point already, the high point value is already up near 400 parts per million, which is way above the average. But it's quite obvious. It's irresistible. They did a good job. They are doing a good job. They are recording this data. They are playing it back to the government and saying, this is a greenhouse gas. It means it traps heat. And it means the more greenhouse gas you put in the atmosphere, obviously the more heat you're going to trap. End of argument. There'll be some complexities to talk about within that, but it's dead simple. And the negotiators on day one in 1990 said, if you read the so-called IPCC, or Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, first report published that year, the problem is real. It's simple in American language, sophomore physics. You do this at school. The only questions are how much, how soon, how much damage, and how quickly. In terms of the response, to solve this problem faster than you're causing it, we're emitting millions, billions of tons of CO2, or just the carbon from the CO2 from oil, coal, and gas burning, and another 20% from forest burning. And it's just going up into the atmosphere. The trend has been that 100% of any year went up, half of it stayed there, half of it came back. Unfortunately, the constancy of that fraction is no longer constant. More of it stays, on average, than half, and it's rising. So you can say it looks like that. There's fossil fuel burning there. It is divided in half. that was the effect on the atmosphere until whatever that was, 2006. Is the concentration path going to go there, or is it actually going to accelerate? Either way, it's bad news. We've got to stop that accelerating. And you can just add the forest component onto that. It's all about being very orderly in your measurement and trying to hold people who are negotiating, never mind the scientists, but the policy community, to the full loop analysis, to the cradle-to-cradle analysis of all of this. Really think about the consequences of what's happening, not just in a short-term sense, not even in a long-term sense, in a full-term sense. The event that we need to stabilize the rising concentration of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere is, quote, a full-term contraction event on emissions. That means emissions currently at about 6 billion tons in total gross per annum need to come down to zero. So there's the opening position. You've got all the fossil fuel emissions coming down to zero by 2050, and the official understanding of that was it would return the concentrations, if you will, the bath. It would prevent it overflowing, and it would come to this line here, return eventually to so-called 353 parts per million by volume, what was in 1990. That was deemed by the environmental community at the outset to be safe. Necessary, difficult, but safe. Well, what we've understood since then is that assumed the atmosphere was accumulating at a constant rate of 50%. The sinks were absorbing the other 50%. Well, for the purposes of argument, to try and sharpen people up about that, what this diagram shows you in the shaded area is if you assumed, for the purposes of argument, that you were absorbing in the atmosphere 100%, the sinks were not functioning. It would be the shaded area. So that's the line F. And the line E goes from 50% to 100% in 200 years. So it assumes the sinks are gradually failing. So what that's actually saying to you is, even if we got the global community to agree to reduce emissions to zero by 2050, you can't reliably assume that concentrations are going to come back like that. Other things may kick in the form of sink failure and aggravations like that, which no longer make that reckoning reliable, the initial scientific suggestion. So you can then see, if you go at a slower rate of contraction, obviously that envelope up here of concentrations, this is the problem. This is the absolute issue on which everything turns as far as the climate debate is concerned, if you're dealing with the objective of the convention. The convention says you must stabilize greenhouse gas concentration in the atmosphere at a level which is stable and safe. And what's not safe is when it gets to a point the other side of which there's nothing you can do because there's so much momentum in the system's change. Sinks are feeding back as sources that you can control emissions till you're blue in the face. It's not going to help. So we're already, I mean, it feels kind of calm and quiet, and only a few of us are having run-ins with the police right now. But this is an emergency. We've got a grace period during which we can consider this still in a rational way and decide there's nothing I can do about this, or actually this is so important I've got to find a way of somehow doing something about this. Or, as some of the cynics say, hey, what's wrong with global warming? It gets rid of so many people who weren't really wanted in the first place. You find that on the dark green side and the really sort of redneck business side. It's a mess out there. It's a jungle. I mean, it's a battle zone. It's not a nice place to be, but we're all there. If you do it even more slowly, you're potentially faced with that. A conservative guess is you would get to so-called CO2 doubling at 500 parts per million within roughly 100, 150 years, if you manage to reduce emissions by, call it 80% within 150 years. Nod if you've heard of Nicholas Stern. Quite a lot of nods. He's the government, or was the government's sort of key economist on the issue. When he published his famous report in 2006, he said we ought to be aiming to achieve 550 parts per million CO2. So in other words, achieving that line, and the arithmetic that he was following was that amount of output. A year later, 2007, he said, oh my God, I seriously underestimated the dangers involved. We should be more aiming for that. And he's got one more to go. Maybe you can help. He needs to be arguing this case. We all do. It's actually dead simple. It's the usual thing about who gets how much and why, and who gets to die. That's basically politics. I know it's not nice, but we're sort of growing up in rather panicky times. Politics is civilized to the level of being skin deep. Underneath it, there are really raw human emotions and tensions on all sides. And the need to remain rational in this, it's a bit like the nonviolent direct action when you're being screamed at by the police. It's the same situation here. No matter how violent the arguments become, you've got to keep rational. If we abandon rationality, I think it's going to be a dogfight. There's that same, if you will, contraction and convergence, matching expansion and divergence, measured as pollution. The industrial countries produced crudely 2/3 of it in the past, and if you just went down pro rata, a bit like a poll tax. There it is as pollution. Here it is as people. The industrial country group, in fact, represents only about 1/3 of global population, and the industrializing country group about 2/3. Well, now here, if you split it, there's 2/3 of pollution and 1/3 of pollution. But in the future, if you took a position pragmatically that the atmosphere, if it belongs to anybody and if its use is for anybody, it's for everybody. You basically say, could we make a deal? You have that sort of, you remember the history of the American Revolution. After they'd had their Civil War, they decided to set up a new shop. The first thing they did was a sort of an export from the French Revolution, was to create a Bill of Rights. It said the rights are equal and inalienably so to all people. In fact, they used the word men, but we would say people today, because not because of Sarah Palin, but because the women generally regard themselves as relevant too, which is quite right. Anyway, so if you say, well, if we assume that the rights to use the atmosphere as a pollution dump or whatever were in principle equal, could we talk on that basis? When that was first introduced, it was regarded as extreme heresy. Now it's embarrassingly conservative to say that, because it's not equitable enough in the minds of some people. But anyway, the argument at the UN is just about this, just about that bit. Who gets the right to have that bit of future emissions? This is what contraction and convergence addresses. If, remember, pollution is proportional to money, that's the status quo problem. So the right to pollute is the right to be rich, crudely speaking. And most people on the planet are saying, excuse me, when's it my turn? You know, like, you guys had it all, and we think it's our turn now. And we're more than you, and we're bigger than you, and we're actually, in a whole lot of ways, more efficient than you. Think of the way China's buying up the USA. You don't go around saying, as the economists did, oh, well, cost-benefit. Stern got caught in this too. 15 dead Chinamen equal 1 dead Englishman. Wrong, people. The totally stupid way, you will not manage anything on such a stupid way of measuring. You've got to assume some very fundamental points about how to generate consensus. That is not a way to do it. And they tried it and they were proved horribly wrong. So it's simply about that bit. What's the rate we can negotiate for convergence on that bit? Is that, I mean, that's as simple as it's possible to make it. And it's important to be that simple, because playing the fiddle is actually dead easy. You pick up the box and you put it up here, and then you pick up the bow and you scratch it. Anybody can do it. You have to work at it to get a bit better at it, but in principle it's very, very straightforward and obvious. And you get better at the fine measurement, but it's always within the structure that's given, the natural structure, the full loop structure of physics, of acoustics, and if you will, in the bigger system, what goes around comes around. It's true at any level. It's actually the basis of all religion, cause and effect. There is no way. What goes around, it comes back. And that's quite a tough discipline to live by, you know, for Buddhists or whatever. Okay, so we've seen that bit. here's exactly the same, very quickly, equivalent in terms of contraction and convergence. There's the fast rate of contraction and convergence. It says the entitlements to emit are equal by person, but since the parties to the UN are nation states, we'll take the populations of countries as being the equivalent of the per capita assessment, and we'll converge to equality, in this case, by, what did we say, 2020, contracting fully by 2050. But the same logic applies if you do it more slowly. You can do it at whatever rates you set up. And the point about it is it's rational. You're not just making it up as you go along. You actually have not only a structure, you have a strategy for engagement. It's true even if you do it at rates which are too slow, but it's the same structure. So our strategy should be focused on how do you organize that at rates which are quick enough to solve the problem, rather than merely pretend, like Nicholas Stern and others were doing a while ago, that you're engaging with it. I might say also, when he originally produced his report, he singled CNC out as a lunatic assertion. It had no political support. It had no arguments to support it. It sounded sweet, but it was, he didn't use the word, but bullshit. And he behaved like that for about a year. Then he ran into a lot of flack from both sides. Some people saying CNC wasn't relevant, others were saying it wasn't enough in terms of equity, and he completely reversed his position. This is economists doing politics on the grand global stage with a lot of UK money behind them, saying, actually it's a spectacular form of inequity, far from being equitable, this equal rights to the atmosphere. It's given the circumstances, given the historic debt of industrial country emissions to the atmosphere and the overload already created, the structural advantage already created on the back of that, it's a massive inequity. And, once again, it should be banned. And only February this year, he again reversed his position after several others did, saying, actually, it's pragmatic. That's interesting. It's not moral. It's pragmatic. The reason is you can actually cope with the measurement challenges inside a structure that you can understand and that you can communicate. Equal rights to emissions under the limit that saves us. There's CNC in a nutshell. Equal rights to the atmosphere under the limit of its use, which saves us. Contraction is the limit that saves us. Convergence to equal per capita sharing is equal rights. That's, in principle, how simple it is. Okay, so now you go on to energy by other means. Well, okay, there's many, many champions of renewable energies in many forms. Solar power, concentrated solar power, photovoltaic, wind power, all hydropower, mini hydro, all sorts of ideas that are bursting to come through, but they're struggling against the mismanagement of not necessarily the economists, but economics and the issue of price. It's cheaper, we are told, to burn fossil fuel than it is to build windmills and so on. And then all sorts of silly things come off the back of that. So some of you probably were at Kingsnorth recently, where the government is saying, no, we mustn't emit more, but we must have Kingsnorth, because Kingsnorth is going to be the place where we're going to be able, I hope, they say, to test this new controversial technology, which is to burn all the fossil fuel and then recapture it out the smokestack and stick it under the ground. It's not proven, but we're quite hopeful. But unless that project actually goes ahead, we won't have the opportunity to test it out. Now, talk about digging up a corpse to hold a funeral. It's actually cheaper to leave it in the ground. Anyway, so the point is the renewables are up against this price competition, and that's the market. You go for the cheapest option. All of us do. If you can get 2 oranges for the price of 1, you'll probably get them. The fact they might be lousy quality, well, you'll find that out too late. They look like oranges. So there is CNC at the same 3 rates. So this is column, whatever it was, number 4 in the booklet. And the point was that the renewables were the sunrise agenda. It's the good news agenda. It's, hey, is there any good news? Yeah, this is it. There are other ways of doing this. We just got to beat this price war. How do you do that? Well, part of the trouble is, in economics, you have this thing called efficiency, which to an engineer, an efficiency gain is that you put less effort in relation to the output you get from a given energy device. In economics, it's the same word, but it's a quite different idea. It's called, if you can get more profit for the same outlay, that's efficient. If you can get a bigger return for your outlay, That is efficient. And people who get bigger profits are more efficient. And more efficient, it's like cleanliness next to godliness. You know, efficiency is next to godliness. So if you're a real casino player in the market, and you're no longer investing in actual products, you're just investing in financial products and derivatives, and basically going to the casino and getting lucky and getting stinking rich. Never mind if the market crashes globally, you're in Wall Street and you're okay and you're dead rich and you're efficient, and that's the way to go. Nobody agrees with it, but that's the reality. And it's called efficiency. And in reality, if that's called sunshine, that's called moonshine. It's complete nonsense. It's divorced from the real world. Everybody knows it. Nobody knows quite how to break out of it. Climate change is challenging us to do that in short order. If we're going to do it, the issue is not whether we're going to do it or not. The issue is, if we're going to do it, how are we going to account for this globally? How are you going to create an inclusive agreement which deals with the following little problem? I mean, this is truly shocking. That is percents per annum between 1960 and the year 2000, on a percent scale here, going from plus 6% to minus 4%, the fossil fuel usage per annum grew negatively on that curve over those 40 years. This is GWP's gross world product. The Yorkshiremen say, where there's muck, there's brass. You know, where there's money, there's mess. Well, that is the classic global demonstration of it. That is data sets from the IMF. I mean, it doesn't get better than that. If you emit more, the odds are you're making more money. If you emit less, this has been the historical pattern, you're making less money. These two dips here in the 70s were, anybody guess, the oil shocks. In 72, when OPEC was formed, boom, the price of oil went up massively. People were shooting each other in the queues for petrol or gas in the United States. That wasn't fun. And then it happened again at the end of the decade. The point is, we're stuck in that relationship with money and pollution, and that's causing global warming. And the people who say that making more money is the most important priority here are not particularly responsive to the fact that tied to it is pollution. So when these price issues come up, they use a lot of their institutional power to leverage and lobby the argument, so that it always, so far, has gone in favor of oil, coal, and gas. It's still true to this day. I mean, there's more anxiety about it now, no question about that, but we're still caught in that lockstep. This is how bad it is globally. If you think of that opening bell curve I showed you of expansion, divergence, contraction, convergence, this is just the first half, the expansion and divergence side, between, quote, people, pollution equals CO2 emissions, and the money that was generated off the back of it. So if you look at the people, this is over the same 40 years. The people debiting the system were people who were above the global average of per capita CO2 output associated with the amount of money they were making, but here it is as people. It's split like that. So the creditors were smaller in number, but these were people who in effect had a negative impact. They were like a human sink. Their impact was so slight. On a global average, you would reckon it to be below an impact level. They're virtually service providers rather than account debitors, put it like that. Here's the distribution of creditors and debitors in relation to the numbers of people. Most people on the planet were not, in effect, debiting the climate system. If you measure it in this way, if you take this per capita average globally of roughly a ton per person for 1990, and you look at it and say, we were told to cut by 60%, see who's above and below the 0.4 of a ton, you still find 2/3 of people are above it, right? So if you put that as a stream alongside, it looks like that. And then you come to the killer. This is really the guts of the whole problem, the money. This was the split. The 2/3 of people who weren't causing the problem, who caused at best about 20% of the pollution, had access in any given year to about 6% of US dollar purchasing power. So that's 4 billion people with 6% of global purchasing power versus 1/3 of people with the other 94%. It's a simplification, but the trend analysis is absolutely clear and indisputable. the majority of people on the planet who've not been consuming at levels which cause climate change, not only had that split, it was the purchasing power, the income, the spending power, like go shopping on Fifth Avenue in New York power. They had was at best 6%. This is not a sort of a left-right argument. This is a social system which has gone berserk. How the hell do you turn that around? So if we go on to the next bit, you then have to add the final part of the argument. It's column 3 in what you're looking at. Here's a bit of a real-world data set to do with damages and rates of damage. That's roughly 150 years worth of, this is US government data, all cyclones, etc., aggregated over time. Clearly it's cyclic, but the trend is rising. Here it goes cold phase, warm phase, and so on, but the warmer it is, the more it's rising, and the whole thing is rising. It's warmer. It's screamingly obvious. And they're damaging. I mean, Katrina just had its sort of stepchild go through, and Gustav, fortunately not as bad. It's poor people who get hit. And here's the insurance industry's estimate. This is the key one. This is the wrong graph, actually, because it includes some non-climate related damages, but it's a good proxy for the moment. The actual paid out losses over this time were on average at 3% per annum. So people who had insurance properties against flood damage, storm damage, and that sort of thing, who called in their premiums, called in their policies for having paid their premiums, the insurance companies at the top level, the reinsurers, paid out on a trend average of 3% per annum. So that rate is the same rate as the growth of the economy. It's at a lower level, but it's accelerating. But if you look at this top trend line here, these are the insurers' estimates of what they would have had to pay out if everybody had had insurance, which obviously everybody didn't. And it's a trend curve which is going at twice the rate. That's 6%. Ouch. That's really bad news. Why? Because you then come on to this column 3. What does this mean in terms of the benefit of growth going up at 3%, tracked by a damage curve going at twice the rate? This is the solving the problem faster than you're creating it. Okay? I mean, we're all, if we're honest about this, we're locked in deep trouble at this point. The system is already not just programmed, it's actually operating on this perverse trend path. We are creating the problem on average faster than we are responding to it, and we have to prevent that. So the key thing is, what can you do to prevent that? Directly, the only thing you can do is there's the concentrations at the back, if you remember, slightly there. The only direct control we've got is over emissions in order to stop concentrations rising out of control. And we have to do that fast enough to make the difference, to make the damage curve come down. So let's say we went at the medium rate. It would look more like that. Concentrations wouldn't have been in danger of going up so far. There they are, up there. But that's still an upward curve of damages. Now let's say it's going at only 3%. The fact that it's going at the same rate of growth doesn't really matter. The growth is a kind of fiction. It's a sort of a Wall Street stockbroker's account of the world. The real damages are things like Haiti, like Katrina, like Bihar, like Bangladesh. There's real people underwater, and they're not happy about it. So if we suggest, manage to get emissions down to zero globally within 50 years roughly of now, you might just get concentrations to be low enough. There they were. You might just avoid that and keep that rise in damage curve under control. But to do that, you've got to get an international agreement. You've got to basically resolve this horrible argument at the headline between the United States and China. China quite rightly says, we didn't make this mess. You did. You clean it up. And the US quite understandably says, but even if we did it all by ourselves, it wouldn't make that much difference because it's a global atmosphere, and regardless of where the emissions came from, they go up there and they stay up there and everybody takes the hit. We have to figure out a way of doing this together. We have to overcome this kind of politics of blame. which has been dominant at the UN, and this kind of apartheid economy where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. The rich get fewer and the poor get more plentiful. It's a bad political balance faced with this problem. And 10 years ago when Kyoto was created, the political atmosphere was lobbyists on the US side, mostly from government, not from government, but sort of tentatively through oil, coal and gas being their base, representing government, saying, taking out full-page ads and TV ads saying, there isn't a problem, they didn't believe in global warming, and you can't solve it without developing countries. I figured that one out. And on the other side, a lot of the campaigning community said, yes, there is a problem, and you can solve it without developing countries. You know, like, it's a sort of horrible mismatch. And the point about it was, you needed a whole engagement, a unity of strength-based engagement, but you needed to reconcile within that these trends of asymmetric development, poverty and wealth widening, and take account of this horrific rate of damage increase. The double jeopardy of asymmetric damages and of asymmetric development and damages. And we're all involved in that. And it's very, what can I say, understandable to look at that and think, God, if it's really that bad, count me out. There's nothing I can do or anybody can do about that. That's James Lovelock. There are other people who take a range of positions on it. A lot of practical things are being done. A lot of really important initiatives are being taken in alternative energy, but all of them are frustrated because of the way the market works, which undervalues the real importance of what they're doing, because as things stand, burning fossil fuels and ignoring the hit in other people and making the mess doesn't get accounted for. So when we go back to the opening proposition, which is what you can measure, you can manage, but what goes around comes around, and you're dealing in effect with a 400-year envelope. I mean, it's a big issue. It doesn't just come right. And you're trying to not only resolve a very bitter argument at the UN between people whose sense of historic injustice is very great and move beyond the politics of revenge and blame and so on into a reconciliation. You have to have a truth on which to base that reconciliation. And I'm saying, and it's more and more widely accepted now, that in principle, contraction and convergence is that truth that embeds that reconciliation. And it was heresy 15 years ago. It's embarrassingly kind of respectable now. The key thing is, can we organize it fast enough to make the difference that we've got to make? So that's about where I'm going to end, but it's to give a reassurance to anybody here who's involved in the huge variety of campaigning techniques that have emerged here, where you might take on a power station or a bridge or a road building program or an airport or whatever it is. Absolutely continue doing that. In no way does this kind of management speak attempt to say that's not necessary or not legitimate or anything like that. What it's actually saying is, if you're prepared to do all of that, and as the educator Malcolm was saying here, to do it with enough conviction to be prepared to go to jail for a long time, because you'll get booked. You will. When you're up in front of not just the big, but in front of the jury, the appeal that is strongest to them is not only to say, I was doing this because this was wrong. Part of its wrongness was its damage on other people, its bad influence on my kids' future and all of that. So I was opposing wrong practice. The other key bit, the real difficult bit of campaigning, is the positive bit, is to say, and next to that, this is what we're for. Because then you put all of them on trial, because they've got to come up with something better. And if they haven't got it, the chances are they'll join you. So when you go to court, I'm saying please argue for CNC as in respect of what you're for. You're in good company now, embarrassingly good company. You'll put a lot of judges and juries on notice about the fact that you're not whoever might be doing this, they're just to make trouble and to make a point and do a hit and run and all of that and pay the cost in jail. You're actually mature, responsible adults who do think, who do measure, who do understand what goes around, comes around, who are prepared to make a stand against what's wrong and for what's right. Thank you.